Steve Rennie. I am the Ren Baron, and this is my Ren Baron Learning to Fly YouTube channel. It seems that not a week goes by these days where I don't get contacted by one of my YouTube pilot friends asking for some information on my simulator setup. 2 years ago, I posted a video detailing that setup at the time. Back then, I had what I thought was the best available equipment for my Cirrus. My goal in building the system back then was the same as it is now: to make the flight sim experience as close to my real-world experience as possible. And when it comes to flying a sim, that means replacing the computer keyboard with real instruments. While this setup was not perfect, it was 1,000 times better than poking around on a computer keyboard to execute cockpit functions. Back then, my system was a mix of equipment from 2 manufacturers of Cirrus Flight Sim gear. I had a Cirrus-style yoke from Noble Flight Sim, and a PFD, MFD, Cirrus console, and a Cirrus G5 base FMS from Real Sim Gear. The Cirrus-style yoke was a huge improvement over the flight stick I had used previously, which was actually much better suited to some kid using flight sim to fly a fighter plane than it was for training in a Cirrus. The PFD and MFD were replicas of the Garmin G1000 system, which was great, but the PFD and MFD in my Cirrus were custom versions of the G1000 screen, which eliminated a lot of the buttons on the G1000 and placed them down in the FMS. Not the end of the world for sure, but not the replica of the Cirrus cockpit I was looking for. So you'll notice, if you look at the photo here, that I modified them best I could so that the screens match what was in my plane. The Real Sim Gear Cirrus console included a full Cirrus switch panel, a starter switch, fuel tank switch, and flaps all in one place. And that was a step up from the computer keyboard, but not where I would actually find them in my own Cirrus. The Cirrus FMS panel was a huge step up as well. But I fly a G6, which is a slightly different setup, and I found that the more I practice on the G5 FMS, the worse I got in my real cockpit with this G6 FMS. Now, since that video was posted, I've added a few new pieces of equipment to the mix, which address some of the shortcomings you see there. I traded out the G5 FMS for the G6 version. I also added a Stream Deck XL programmable USB controller as well to the setup, which helps me manage all the views in X-Plane. We'll talk more about that a bit later. And finally, I added a Cirrus-style flight throttle quadrant from Noble Flight Sim to the mix. That allowed me to access the flaps and fuel switches in the same places in my real Cirrus cockpit. It also added another important function into the mix, the takeoff go-around button, which I use before every takeoff and when I'm flying missed approaches in IFR. With that setup, I can now do all the meat and potatoes flight functions that I use every day in my Cirrus, whether I'm flying VFR or IFR. Most recently, though, I've added one additional piece of equipment, the Cirrus cockpit from Real Sim Gear, that takes things to a whole new level. So it seemed like a perfect time to update that old video with a brand new one, and that's what today's video is all about. Based on my experience, I think there are 3 key things you're going to need to think about when you're putting together your simulator. Number 1, logistics. Where are you going to put it? How are you going to hook it up? Number 2, you're going to need to think about hardware, things like PC and flight instruments. And then finally, software. On today's video, I'm going to focus on the first 2 items, logistics and hardware / equipment, and we'll talk about the software side of things on the next video. First, let's talk about logistics. You're going to need to find a suitable space to put your simulator. The amount of space you're going to need will depend on how you set that simulator up. You'll need to consider things like what kind of desk or platform are you using and how much room will it take up. Are you going to use one monitor or multiple monitors? Will the monitor/monitor sit on your desk or be on floor stands? Where are you going to put your computer? Are you going to put it on the desk, under the desk, attached to the desk? Now, it's almost guaranteed that at some point you're going to need to access the back of your computer, so making sure you have room to get at it is going to be really important. You're also going to want to make sure you're near a power outlet because you're going to have all kinds of devices that are looking for power. And finally, you're also going to want to make sure you have great light around your simulator as well. Here's what my flight sim area looks like. It's 8 feet wide by 7 feet long. And now let me tell you all the pieces that make it up. The first thing you should think about is a desk or your platform where you're going to put your simulator. My desk is 73 inches long, it's 33.5 inches wide, It's 28 inches from the ground to the bottom where my legs will touch and 29 inches to the top. It sits on top of 6 roller wheels, which makes the whole setup completely mobile. I have one 6-outlet power supply mounted on top of the desk and another one on the back side of the desk. This desk previously served as a TV production / editing desk, which made it uniquely qualified for my sim setup, and here's why. This desk is equipped with a 4-unit rack mount, which comes in very handy. It's got room for 2 rack-mounted storage drawers, one which I use for manuals and so forth, and the second one I use for cables associated with my whole sim setup here. So I equipped it with a rack-mounted power strip with 4 powered USB ports up front and 3 plugs, and there's another 6 outlets on the back side of this. Those 4 USB ports up front allow me to power my iPad, my iPhone, and my AirPods, which makes it very handy. And the 3 plugs up front are nice and easy if I need to plug in something like in front of me, like the lights that I use for streaming and so forth. But more importantly, I'm able to put my big-time gaming PC right into that rack. It's an 8-core i7 processor clocked at 4.8 gigahertz. It's got 1 terabyte of storage and 36 gigabytes of memory. It also comes equipped with an NVIDIA RTX 2070 video card with 8 gigabytes of DDR6 RAM and 2 USB ports up front. And finally, positioned directly over the desk is an overhead light that I can focus right on the sim so I can make sure I can see what's going on. Now, I was really lucky. That desk solved a whole bunch of logistical problems and, more importantly, allows me to move the whole thing around whenever I need to, which I just can't tell you how happy I am about that. Now, you're going to need a keyboard and mouse to use with the PC. On my sim setup, I use a Logitech keyboard and mouse. The keyboard is wireless and connects to the PC with a Bluetooth adapter. The mouse is an old-school wired USB device. Both of them connect to a USB 3.0 hub. And while we're on the subject of USB devices, what I found is that I had a whole lot of devices that connected to USB ports, many more ports than I actually had on my PC. So to manage all those ports and wires, I use a USB 3.0 hub with 16 powered ports and individual on and off switches. It's mounted to the back of my desk by Velcro, where all the wires connecting to it are out of sight, which keeps things looking clean from the front and still provides easy access. Now, that PC is really the heart of a great sim setup, that's for sure. But once you've got your computer dialed in, the next most important piece of your sim will be your monitor. On my sim setup, I use a Samsung 49-inch curved monitor. This low profile on the monitor here provides a great little look here, and strange enough, it happens to be just about the width of my cabin in my Cirrus, so it provides me almost a realistic view out the front window. Now, I know that lots of folks use a multi-monitor setup, and I actually considered that for my sim setup but decided against it for now. Perhaps I'll revisit it in the future. Now, for anybody that has ever taken a flight lessons, you've no doubt heard the expression, keep your eyes out the window. And there's no question that seeing what's going on in your airplane is hugely important. But what I've learned is that hearing what's going on is almost just as important. And to make sure I can hear what's going on in my sim, I can choose between 3 different devices. First, I've got a pair of Logitech desktop speakers, one on each side of the monitor. These desktop speakers are attached to the speaker port at the back of the PC. Or I can use a Bose headset with headphones and mic. The Bose headset attaches to the PC by a USB controller, which is attached to the side of the Cirrus Cockpit Throttle unit, as you can see right here, and is plugged into the USB hub. Finally, I can also use a pair of Apple AirPods as well. Now, the Bose headset is my go-to option, especially when I'm using Pilot Edge plug-in to talk with ATC. We'll talk more about Pilot Edge a bit later. Okay, now let's talk about all the equipment you're going to need to actually fly the plane. You're going to need a throttle to control your power. You're going to need a flight stick of some kind to help you steer the plane up, down, right, and left. You're going to need some rudder pedals to help you control the yaw. And you're going to need a whole bunch of switches, buttons, gauges, and instruments to monitor all those important functions of your engine and avionics. In most cases, you would need to buy each of these items individually and assemble them all in a way that makes it all work. And that's certainly a lot of work and a lot of stuff that can go wrong. And that's why my new Real Sim Gear Cirrus Cockpit is such a game changer in my sim setup. It puts all those pieces together in one unit with one connection to my PC. So now let me give you a tour of my brand new Cirrus Cockpit by Real Sim Gear. Now, while aesthetics won't help you fly the plane, it'll make you feel better about flying the plane and flying the simulator here. So the first thing you'll notice is this beautiful headliner in kind of faux leather, hand stitched in red, which just looks awesome and is very similar, except for the color of the threads, to my own plane. Adding to the aesthetics are 4 air vents that are placed just like they are in the real plane. They're not going to help you fly the plane, they're not going to keep you cooler, but they're going to make you feel better again. One of the other things you're going to notice from this current Cirrus cockpit to the cockpit setup I had previously is that the PFD and the MFD now fully resemble the Cirrus PFD and MFD that you'd find in a real SR22. In the past, they were generic G1000 screens, which meant they had buttons here, and buttons here. Those are now gone, and they've been replaced by screens that look exactly like the ones in the plane, even down to the SD card slots here on the right. First thing you'll notice down below is my rudder pedals, which are made by Logitech. The rudder pedals are mounted on top of a little board that's attached to my desk, and they're laid on top of Velcro so that they stay very firm, but I can move them when necessary. This makes sure when I need to move the simulator setup, I can move the whole desk around and don't have to move anything else, which is just huge. The rest of the instruments that I'm going to need to use to fly the plane are all located here, right in my Cirrus cockpit from Real Sim Gear, and it just makes everything so easy. This is the Cirrus SR22 cockpit is depicted in my Torque Sim aviation model that I fly within X-Plane. We'll talk about that later, but here's a good place to start. Let's start up in that top left corner and go left to right and describe everything and then compare it to the real deal. In the top left corner, you got an air vent and an air vent over here on the right, the same as in the real Cirrus. The placement of the starter switch is exactly true to the actual plane. Now you'll notice in a real Cirrus SR22 there's a little air conditioning control unit. That unit is not included here on the Cirrus cockpit setup, which won't present much of a problem in reality when you're flying the simulator. The only time that will become an issue is if you're using your Cirrus cockpit to simulate certain emergencies, and one in particular would be if you got icing on the windshield. Turning on the air conditioning at full heat and blowing it hard on the windshield is part of that fix. So that'll be one of the rare instances you actually have to use your mouse or keyboard to execute a command within X-Plane. Now let's talk about the switch panel. Here is what the switch panel looks like in a real Cirrus. It's got a number of buttons all the way across the bottom and dimmer switches for the instrument and panel. All of that is replicated here on the switch panel except for one thing which I just noticed the other day. In a real SR22 or 20, there's one extra button. It's for the windshield icing. That button is not here on the switch panel, just FYI. Again, not the end of the world in terms of flying the simulator, because the only time that'll really come into play is in an icing type of scenario. So that'll be just one of those times you have to go click on the button over here with your mouse in X-Plane. Now here's a brand new feature in the Cirrus cockpit, this new version that I love, and that's this digital backup display here. Now, in reality, it's a little bit bigger than the one in the SR22, which I wish the one in the SR22 was a little bit bigger, because this one is certainly a lot easier to read. Now, for those of you folks that have a G6, you'll know that the barometer up top and the one down here on the digital backup display are synced up. That's a little issue. That's a software issue, which I suspect will be fixed shortly. Just FYI, here's what that backup instruments looks like in my G3 flight model that I use when I'm flying in X-Plane. So this is a little upgrade for me. I love it. Okay, while we're here, let's talk about this great new Cirrus yoke. It absolutely has the feel of my Cirrus yoke in my SR22. The pressure going in, the pressure going out, the pressure right and pressure left is a little stiff, and that's exactly the way it is in a real SR22. You'll also note that it's got the trim button right here, the autopilot disconnect on top, and push to talk around this side. It's got that stitched leather feel that I just love on my Cirrus side yoke. It also has the same markings that you have on the plane that give you an idea of where you're trimmed left and right, and in terms of pitch and takeoff right here. Really, really great recreation of the Cirrus yoke, and I just love it. Okay, now let's talk about this beautiful FMS right here. Now, this is a G6 version of the FMS, which is what I have in my plane. It's a little bit different in the X-Plane flight model. The buttons feel great. They twist nicely. They push in nicely. They've got a very firm, tactile feel to them, which is just awesome. On the G6 version, it has 1 to 10 across the top. It has a QWERTY keyboard, which is just great when you spent your whole life typing. Here is the autopilot controller, where there are some slight differences from the version that you find in a G6. And the differences are as follows. Down here you have a button, the track button. On the SR22 G6, there are only 3 buttons here, and what you see here, the nav button is down here, and that button is gone. Over here in the middle of the autopilot controller, one other slight difference here. There is no yaw damper button on the G6 version of the autopilot controller because the yaw damper is automatic on the way up and on the way down. The roll button here, down and up, feels just great. Over here on the very right side, on the altitude select side of things, one small difference here. Where this button says indicated airspeed, it's FLC, flight level change, on the G6 Perspective Plus version of the avionics software. Down here at the audio panel, the COM1, the COM2, and the nav are the ones that are operational. The rest of the stuff is mostly for show right now, but it's a very accurate representation of my audio panel in my plane. Okay, now let's talk about the throttle quadrant. Let's start with the flaps. The flap switch has a great feel to it, a nice solid click up and down, so there's no mistaking that you've done something with your flaps. The green light that you see here is reflective of what actually happens in the plane. When you first start up and you have your flaps up, the green light won't appear. If it does appear, it means you have an electrical problem. When you light up battery 1, it will light up, so that's very accurate. Now you'll notice here on the throttle quadrant section here that this space is blank on the Cirrus cockpit setup. In my Cirrus, there's a oxygen control unit here for the built-in oxygen system. This again will be one of those few instances where if you want to use oxygen in your simulator flight, you'll have to go poke around with your mouse up on the actual X-Plane model. Let's talk about the boost pump. When you're starting up my plane, I'm going to hit the prime button for 4 seconds. That feels like the real deal. Love it. Now, once I get ready to start flying, I'll put it in boost and push the button forward. Again, solid click, very similar to what's going on in the plane. The throttle moves up nice and smooth and slowly here. Underneath here, you have your takeoff go-around button, which is a key part of your IFR training and allows you to do every single maneuver that you'd have to learn. The mixture moves nice and smoothly as well. All of that smoothness, or the tension, you can control right here. Push it forward, it makes it a little bit tighter, back a little bit looser, and you can really dial it into your personal preference. With the fuel tank switches here, left, right, nice solid click to it, just like in the real plane. Unlike in a real Cirrus where you'd have to lift this up and then move it to off, that's not necessary here on the Cirrus cockpit from Real Sim Gear. One interesting note here. When you're in X-Plane now and you're ready to fly your own flight model here, you need to go down to the throttle quadrant here and make sure that it's starting in left or right position, because what I've noticed is there's a tendency, it's a little software glitch, where your X-Plane model starts off with the fuel tanks in off, so what happens is you'll get the plane started and it'll immediately quit. So make sure you go check down here on your throttle quadrant, make sure it's set right there. Notice there's a couple other key pieces of my simulator setup that I wanted to talk about, and one in particular is this device you see right here. It's a Stream Deck XL USB programmable controller that has 32 separate buttons that you can program any way you want and turn 10 commands into one button. Now, one of the trickiest things for me when flying the simulator versus flying the real plane is handling the views out the window. When you're flying in your own plane, you look left, you look right, you look up, you look down. You don't think about anything. It's all done instinctively. But when you're flying in the simulator, to recreate those views and look out the window left and right, you have to do it through keyboard commands over here that are programmed into X-Plane. And that makes things very tricky for somebody like myself. Not only do you have to learn what those keyboard commands are, you got to remember where they are on the keyboard. And every time you look over here, you're not looking ahead, and that is a big problem. This little device right here solves all of those problems for me. Let me give you a quick idea of how it works. Within X-Plane, there are a number of views that are pre-programmed, and you can access those views up here at the top of the X-Plane window. Now, the problem, of course, is I now have to grab my keyboard and my mouse and go up here and find it. Right here, you can see a couple of those commands: left, right, up and down, forward, backward. And as you notice, rotate up, rotate down, you see little keyboard commands attached to those. So if I scroll down to left, you'll see the view change slightly to the left. If I want to go and move it up, it moves up ever so slightly. If I want to move it, rotate left, I go rotate left. That's one way of doing it. The other way to do it is by accessing it here on your keyboard. But frankly, both of those ways of handling it just don't work for me. Let me show you how I do it with the Stream Deck XL controller. I've got all of the views that I want to see programmed right here, one button for each of them, and let me show you how it works and how easy it is and why it's such a game changer for me. Here we are with the instrument close-up view, as I call it, in my Cirrus cockpit model here. Now, if I want to go look left, I just click the left button and I'm looking left. If I want to go right, I click right. If I want to look at the throttle quadrant, I click throttle quadrant. If I want to go up to my default view where I'm just looking over the cowling, that's what I do. It doesn't get much simpler than that. It takes a small amount of programming to make that happen, and anybody can do it. That's how easy it is to use this X-Plane controller. And then finally, there's one last piece of my cockpit setup that I wouldn't be without, and that's my iPad over here. Now, I'm using an iPad Mini 4 in my cockpit and also here in the simulator. In fact, it's the same one. It's attached to my desk with a Ram Easy Roller mount with a ball mount suction cup. In my real-world SR22 Gen 6, the iPad connects to the avionics system by way of the Flightstream 510 card, which is located up on the MFD. All of the avionics information being generated within the Perspective Plus is sent over to the iPad, turning it into the best backup device of all time. Plus, the fact of the matter is, in so many ways, the ForeFlight app on the iPad is more powerful still than even the Perspective Plus system, and it's certainly easier to get certain information from. So that is why it's such an unbelievably useful tool for me in my cockpit and my Cirrus, and ditto here on the simulator. And it's very easy to set up here on the simulator through X-Plane. Let me show you how. Up here in the top right corner of your X-Plane screen, you'll see a little icon that looks like a couple of recording studio dials. That's the settings buttons. Once you push that settings button, you'll want to come up here to the network tab. And when you've done that, it brings up a whole bunch of different options, including external apps, iPhone, iPad, etc. Enter in an IP address of your computer down here, click Done, and then you'll come over to the iPad. You'll click the More button down at the bottom, the Devices button, and as long as your computer and your iPad are on the same network, all the information from the FMS will flow to the iPad, and now you've got your iPad in the simulator just like you've got it in the plane. What a great trick. Okay, folks, that's the Cirrus Cockpit Simulator from RealSim Gear. I can't tell you how much I love it. It's everything I wanted in a simulator. Very little interaction with the keyboard and the mouse, mostly right here, just like in the real plane. So, for all you folks that have been asking about my simulator setup, there it is, and I hope that helps. Coming up next, I'm going to talk about the software side of my simulator setup, X-Plane, Navigraph, and Pilot Edge. Stay tuned for another video soon. My name is Steve Rennie. I am the Ren Baron. This is my Ren Baron Learning to Fly YouTube channel, and look forward to seeing you again soon.